Welcome back, everyone. And we move on to the next panel session of the day and the last panel, live panel of the day, and which follows on very naturally from the last session. I think in which we unpacked the issue of increasing access to unlicensed spectrum in 6 gigahertz, looking not just at the technology and the rules, but also some of the tensions between the quest for more IMT versus more license exempt spectrum. And I think Chris Wolford really put his finger on it in saying that there is this tension between harmonization and innovation, which is a great segue, if you like, to this next session, which looks at how ISPs and NGOs are innovating with license exempt spectrum and other kinds of dynamic spectrum. And with that, I turn over to Martha Suarez, who will be moderating the session.
Thank you very much, Steve. And I'm very pleased to start this session now. If we could start with slides, please. So these sessions were born, if I may say like that, last year. These are very short sessions. Next one, please. And we invite different speakers that are dealing with the day-to-day issues of connectivity all around the world. So this time we have invited Claude Aiken. He is the President and Chief Executive Officer of Wireless and Internet Service Providers Association in the US, WISPA. And I'd like to say that we, as the DSA, we work closely with ISP providers because none of our companies is deploying networks on different regions. So we basically are advocating for unlicensed spectrum access and for shared spectrum and dynamic spectrum access systems, but we rely on those types of institutions and entities and companies to provide that last mile connectivity. So we would love to hear from Claude about it. Our second speaker will be Richard Thanki. Richard is the co-founder and managing director of Jangala. And we are going to hear about the great initiative that he started from the beginning. And it's a great project to connect people that are suffering very special conditions. So we will hear more. And then we will have Heather Lanigan. Heather is the Regional Director of Sub-Saharan Africa, USTDA agency. And she will also give us a few updates about the activity of USTDA in providing more and better connectivity. So with this introduction, let's start with the first presentation. So Claude, thank you. So we'll start with the Richard Thanki's presentation first. So Richard, thank you very much for accepting our invite and for joining us at the DSA Summit. You are one of those true believers that has always been working with the DSA, and that's amazing. So we really enjoy hearing from you at this point and seeing all the progress. So please go ahead.
Great, thanks for the introduction, Marta. Yeah, it's true that I have been involved with the DSA for a long time, but that was in a previous life as an economist, which I may or may not return to. But one of the privileges that I've seen is, first of all, looking at something from an abstract place, arguing for it from an academic and analytical grounds, and then actually seeing the impact that the work can have in practice. So if we can move to the first kind of slide. So there's a lot of text there, but I helped set up and run an organization called Jangala. So Jangala develops technologies, and we're a charity based in the UK, and we develop technologies that will help partner organizations around the world get important public services to people, such as disaster response, such as healthcare and education. We've been set up with an eye to a future that's going to be marked increasingly by climate disruption and by the need for grassroots activities to quickly set up infrastructure that can help save lives. And the first things we focused on are internet access. So I'll talk a little bit about the big box system, which has kind of grown directly from our work with refugees and in refugee situations, all the way through to some of the stuff we've been doing around COVID. again, with both these products so far, we're primarily employing Wi-Fi. But again, these are just indications of how quickly access to license-exempt spectrum can help an organization like ours develop technologies that are needed. Our longer-term goal as Jangala is to develop kind of products and services that are useful not just in the humanitarian and disaster response space, but more broadly, we want to become a sustainable organization for the future. So if we move on. So maybe a quick word about how kind of Jangala came to be. And Jangala came to be at a time when I was doing some work with one of the DSA's founding members, Microsoft, in its TV whitespace projects in Sub-Saharan Africa. So I was really lucky to be able to go into the field in amongst amazing projects happening in Kenya, Ghana, South Africa, and Namibia, and could see the technologies that people were putting in place to get appropriate, much needed internet access to a number of different locations. But at the same time, the refugee crisis, which kind of peaked in about 2015, 2016 in Europe, was in full swing. And I had some mutual friends who were working in the Calais Jungle refugee camp. And I heard about their need for connectivity. And so suddenly, here was an area where I could help. And people have asked us, well, why would it be that a refugee needs Wi-Fi? But I think, in a sense, time answers that question. And it's not a question we get asked anymore. But here's a quote from Dan Tumer, a rescue worker who we've worked closely with. And that's him on the shores of Lesbos pulling in one of the boats that's kind of come across. And he says, people arrive crying and shaking with trauma. They're hungry, dehydrated, freezing cold and soaking wet. But the first thing they ask me for is not food or water. They ask to borrow my phone or if I have a charger so they can call their loved ones to let them know they are safe, that they made it across alive. They ask me for Wi-Fi. And so in October 2015, we started building the Calais Jungle Wi-Fi network. And the Calais Jungle was a refugee camp with about 10,000 people on the north coast of France, all looking to claim asylum in the UK. Within a few weeks, we had used very kind of standard techniques for setting up Wi-Fi networks to create a network that was serving 5,000 people every day. We had 500 simultaneous users on the kind of busy times of the network, and it was a lifeline for the camp, for organizations that were working in the camp trying to provide services, and of course for the people in the camp for whom a lack of information, a lack of connection was a serious impediment to mental health and sometimes even physical health. So we move on a slide. People going somewhere and setting up Wi-Fi networks who are experts is the traditional model by which connectivity has been delivered in these humanitarian situations. However, it's not a really kind of scalable solution, and we found that. So after our successful work in the Calais Jungle, we were approached by a number of different groups all over Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East, saying, can you help us in our situation? And of course, with crowdfunded donations, you can't really kind of go very far. And so we thought, well, what can we do here? How can we make the best use of our time and what we've learned and the network of expertise that exists, around us, large part because of the DSA. And yeah, so that's where we came up with the idea for Big Box. And so Big Box is our kind of first product. 40 version 1 and version 2 prototypes have been in action all around the world. We'll go through some of their uses in a second. But yeah, Big Box is designed to provide really kind of high performance Wi-Fi that can be easily scaled, using any kind of internet backhaul for connectivity and using multiple kinds of internet backhaul for connectivity. So what Big Box does is it can manage multiple backhaul connections from kind of twin 4G modems that are built inside Big Box all the way through to satellite broadband. It can power point-to-point wireless links, of any kind. And, we're really looking forward to kind of using TV whitespace for some of these in some situations. And then it has the compute power to effectively manage that traffic and make the most of kind of contended links. Most importantly, it requires no technical expertise to use. So we've abstracted away from all of the arcaneness that can be associated with setting up networks. And it's designed to function in tough aid and development situations. So if we go on to the next slide, there are some points on where it's kind of been used. So yeah, Big Box has been used to connect mobile refugee support teams in France, in the Middle East. It's been used to connect entire schools in South Africa. And it's been, currently we've just started deploying to clinics in Sub-Saharan Africa, which of course is very timely given the current pandemic. And our hope now is to move beyond the prototype stage we've been at. And with the help of some of our partners, we're designing the first kind of custom-made version of Big Box that we hope to make available in 2021. So that's really exciting. And that's a picture of Big Box in action in an abandoned kind of warehouse that was serving as a kind of informal refugee camp in Serbia, in Shid. So our plans this year, like everyone else's, were quite derailed by events. We had a number of really exciting projects kind of ready to go that were, really bringing us more towards working with kind of the larger aid organizations who will be kind of our source to sustainability. So we had projects that was about to start in kind of Ethiopia, in Sudan, in northeast Nigeria, and so on. So it was a very exciting time, but a lot of these plans were derailed because of COVID-19. A lot of international organizations, weren't able to move, logistics kind of ground to a halt, and a lot of projects were kind of mothballed for an indefinite time from February, March. And it was at that time, being locked down, that kind of my focus turned back to the UK, and we looked at, what is happening in the UK now that the country's under lockdown. So we spoke to colleagues and friends working in education, working with vulnerable adults, and we found that there was a huge slice of the population of this country that suddenly were cut off from services and didn't have access to the internet, because they didn't have access to the internet at home, because the normal places they would go to get access to the internet were closed, and suddenly there was the digital divide had just gotten a lot wider. So we thought, well, what can we do? Like, Big Box is a kind of, is a specialist product that's quite expensive, that's designed for very large numbers of people. But of course, lockdown made, a very different topography needed. And that's where we came up with the idea of GetBox. So GetBox is a much smaller off-the-shelf form factor that we've selected because it hits a certain number of kind of sweet spots. And so we got to work quickly kind of porting across the most important software features. And kind of moving from kind of quad-core 64-bit to a very different capability processor was a challenge. But thanks to the open source software that forms kind of the heart of both products, we were able to do this. And so our idea for GetBox is as a product that's designed to connect a household. Multiple GetBoxes can work together in a larger dwelling. And yeah, it's designed to kind of connect people who are isolated or locked down, to provide organizations who are deploying Wi-Fi a much more effective way of monitoring, of measuring, of ensuring that their investment's being used by the people they want to use it, than just handing out USB dongles or 4G hotspots. And so we've been using GetBox in a number of situations, which are on the next slide. So those were the very first refugee learners in Athens earlier last month who started using kind of GetBox, and that's being used for refugees who are learning in Greece, who are claiming asylum, to help them continue their studies whilst being locked down. It's being used for shared accommodation for vulnerable adults in Brighton and the south coast of the UK as a trial. It's being used with the UK's NHS to reach post-traumatic stress disorder survivors in London who have kind of been missing the regular contact that forms an important part of their therapy. And yeah, we're racing to make GetBox much more widely available by the end of this year. So it's a hugely needed product, and it's designed to address the gulf in connectivity that exists even amongst high infrastructure countries like the UK. So if we can move on. So I thought I'd bring this back to radio spectrum because working in the field has been really instructive in this regard. So if we go a slide onwards. I mean, there are a number of ways in which the spectrum landscape interacts with our work. But one thing to first bear in mind is that refugees often end up in remote places, or if places aren't physically remote, they're infrastructurally remote. So the Calais Jungle refugee camp was on the edge of a major town in the north of France, Calais. But there were no sectors of cell sites pointing at this former asbestos dump. And yeah, there was no connectivity. We had to set up kind of intricate point-to-point links to get the Calais to get that call into the Calais jungle. And again, that was one of the things that was made difficult by our ability only to access very kind of specific kinds of bands of spectrum. We were able to make it work, and it's a testament to 5 gigahertz. But again, that's something that opening up 6 gigahertz and kind of other bands, will be a huge benefit to people building temporary networks like ours. And that's the backhaul question, but there's also the distribution question as well. So, even with the onset of low Earth orbit satellites and the connectivity they provide, even, with provision of backhaul that's being provided in lots of other innovative ways, like from Loon to drone-based tech onwards, often there is a need of when a connection is established, how do you effectively manage that connection to connect to school? How do you effectively manage that connection to connect a refugee camp or a medical clinic? And how do you prioritize between users? And these are the challenges that Jangala's technology helps to answer. And so the situation is always very dynamic in the field, and disasters strike incredibly quickly. But the pace of change in the spectrum landscape just really hasn't kept up with reality. I think in the sense that, given how quickly technology around software-defined radios, around many things that are going to make it easier and easier to use multiple different frequencies in a device, the system by which spectrum is allocated and managed, it hasn't seemed to have kept pace with that, or with the fact that we are living in an increasingly dangerous world where disasters can strike at any time, and organizations will respond to that. And quite often those organizations will be grassroots organizations. The capacity of states and the capacity of multinational organizations will be stretched. And yeah, the question is, well, how do we keep an eye on how to make policy fit for purpose in this changing world? And that's everything from me.
Thank you, Richard. Great presentation. It really, it's like really nice to see that what you're doing and to hear from the experience about connecting those that need it the most when they need it the most. I would just like to ask you a question about partnerships. How I guess you have learned through this long process of starting Jangala and working on it. What can you tell us about the partnership? Who has been supporting this? How have you been finding partners? And can you please give us a few words about it?
So it's really interesting, and everything we do is based around partnerships. So we never go into the field ourselves. So in terms of our partnerships on the ground, we look for organizations that are well established, that are active in these situations, and we work with their expertise essentially. Situations can be very, very sensitive, and refugee camps are not easy places to work, and so a lot of sensitivity is needed on that side of our partnership scale. But of course, we have our funding partners, without whom we couldn't really do anything. I think a special shout out has to go to kind of the Lenovo Foundation, who have been kind of instrumental in kind of getting us here, but also organizations like BT, like ARM, like other companies involved in technology who who kind of see that this is a kind of very, very basic need. Our model has been quite kind of interesting. I think as we want to develop, we want to make sure that we can make the most of charitable donations that come in, that we can make the most of any kind of commercial opportunities we have to make sure that all of those charitable donations that come in go entirely into projects in the field, and that we can cover our costs in multiple ways. But it's really interesting being a not-for-profit technology company in this landscape, because in an environment where there is kind of more increasing suspicion around technology, having a different approach, one that is based in not-for-profit activity, allows, I think, kind of an interesting set of possibilities to be kind of explored.
Thank you. And we have a question from the audience. So I don't know, I wonder if you could please answer it quickly. So it says box are cool. What's the practical capacity? Or inversely, how many boxes are needed to serve 100 users?
So that's a really good question. So it depends very much on the kind of bandwidth limits that you apply to users. So, you know, we kind of dynamically scale that, but kind of the throughput of a get box is kind of limited to about 30 to 40 megabits per second, because it's both doing the shaping and a single core that's managing the Wi-Fi, but it's based on a very well kind of established chip. And, you know, get boxes are designed to find each other and work together on local area networks. And so they're very easy to put into place in buildings using kind of standard power over power line communications and so on. But, you know, big box is really designed for kind of larger situations. So big box comes with 3 Wi-Fi radios built in, and is designed for kind of, you know, high capacity situations. But, you know, interestingly, even with 20 users all kind of like, you know, working at kind of speeds that allow them to do video and other content, we found that the system can cope really, really well. It's cost effective as well.
Okay, great. Thank you, Richard, for this. And now we are going to move to the next presentation. So I will invite Claude to take the floor. Thank you, Claude, for accepting our invite, and we look forward to hearing from you and WISPA.
Thank you, Martha. It's really great to be here, and thank you to you and to DSA for being such a fantastic partner in our work at WISPA. And kind of in keeping with the theme that Richard started with, it's amazing to me that WISPA in its work in a very developed country like the United States is seeing a lot of the same sort of themes and solutions that Rich was talking about in his last presentation. We see deployed here in the United States to solve some of the same problems that we are seeing. So let's get back into the slides. Wireless internet service providers. If this was not a virtual conference, I would ask for a show of hands to see how many folks are familiar with WISPs. I tend to find that awareness is growing, which is fantastic, but there is still a lot of a lack of understanding about who WISPs are and what they do. And so to kind of aid in that education, I've put up a slide here talking a little bit about some of the stats of who wireless internet service providers are in the United States. These are primarily very small startup type companies that are generally started out of a frustration with a lack of robust connectivity in their community. They start on a bootstrap, usually someone putting their life savings on the line, or even going into credit card debt to start an ISP, and they start usually on unlicensed spectrum. It's that low barrier to entry spectrum that gets folks into the business. But then from there, they start to scale. There's a couple of WISPs in the United States now who have tens of thousands or even 100,000 customers that are served. But they're not traditionally well-known or well-established companies. And so their needs tend to be not quite as well understood as by policymakers here in the United States. And that's where we as WISPA come in to educate policymakers and the public about who WISPs are, as well as educating WISPs about what spectrum policy, infrastructure policy, and other things mean for this growing and dynamic sector. So if we could move on to the next slide. So what do WISPs do? We've seen, and we'll talk a little bit about COVID and its impact. I think that's going to be a continued theme throughout this conference and throughout this presentation. But One of the things that WISPs are great at doing are fast and cost-effective deployments. So example from one of our members, they were asked by a local health authority to set up connectivity to a COVID screening tent relatively early on in the pandemic, and they were able to get this done in a matter of days, as opposed to the weeks or even months that the other incumbents were quoting this healthcare institution to do. These are often companies that are the first terrestrial provider in rural areas, or the first real competitor in urban areas. We do see urban wireless ISPs gaining market share from some of the incumbents, even in urban areas. Then, as I mentioned previously, while many have started their business on unlicensed spectrum on the 900 megahertz, 2.4 gigahertz, 5 gigahertz bands, as they grow and as customer demand continues to grow, we see the need for more unlicensed and also more lightly licensed and dynamic spectrum that is made available on terms that make sense to smaller entrepreneurs and to innovators. So if we can move on to the next slide. So yes, COVID-19, as Richard was mentioning, that's put an incredible strain on vulnerable populations here in the United States and worldwide. And it's interesting to hear that some of the same mechanisms for getting folks online that have been used in the developing world are still used here in the United States to get folks online who may not have robust connectivity where they live. So we saw a lot of our members standing up multiple free Wi-Fi hotspots at key spots in the community. These were free at no cost to the folks that were using them. It was just amazing to see these small companies, some of whom just have a handful of customers, not even 100 customers, but with that dedication to serve their community. They took on the cost of providing free connectivity to that community to be able to keep parents working, keep kids learning, and keep vulnerable populations getting access to telehealth and to healthcare. As a result of the pandemic, we also took a survey of how the pandemic was impacting the industry. And as I'm sure you've seen from other numbers, no surprise, bandwidth usage has increased pretty significantly. But interestingly enough, one of the major policy debates that we see occurring now here in the United States is the need for symmetric connectivity, both up and down. And that's in our work and in our research, that's just not borne out by how consumers are using the networks, even in times of incredibly high stress. While peak upload and peak download continue to drive forward, consumers are still picking relatively modest data plans and are still using them. Even where symmetrical bandwidth is being provided, they're using that asymmetrically. So let's move on to the next slide. So we, as an organization, reflect our members and what they need, and to try to really get at and support organizations that are out there on the front lines, solving the digital divide in the United States and providing more competition. And we have kind of 4 high-level bullet points that we see as potential for really moving the conversation forward on these issues. Spectrum policy, it's no surprise that's a key plank of what we see as fixed wireless providers. Subsidy mechanisms are also really important. Historically, they've been very much allocated and directed to traditional players, and innovators and entrepreneurs have been viewed with a little bit of skepticism in terms of their ability to really to solve for X and to really provide that service. But thankfully, what we're seeing here in the U.S. is that while the solutions are still sometimes moving at the pace of government, we're seeing movement in more technology neutral, in policy that will allow innovators and entrepreneurs to come to the table and participate in those mechanisms. So, but that continues to be an area where we can really see a positive movement in terms of being able to promote innovation and rural access here in the U.S. Infrastructure policy is also a no-brainer. While a lot of WISPs will mount their radios on rural water towers or grain silos, access to rights-of-way, poles, towers, again, for smaller companies that don't necessarily have that regulatory history or the capacity to jump through all of the historical regulatory hoops that have been set up. It's a key priority in terms of being able to streamline things and right size it for small companies that are really focused on their serving their community as opposed to pleasing Wall Street shareholders. Last one, and again, this overarches kind of the first three. Small business. As you saw from my first slide, that average WISP here in the United States has 1,500 customers. Contrast that with some of our larger ISPs here in the United States that have 30 to 40 million customers, and you're seeing how if a regulatory or a legislative schema is adopted that that takes into account those larger providers, you've got to really take into account the smaller providers as well and their ability to move to whatever regulatory or legislative framework is adopted. So that's the high level. I think with the next slide, we'll dive in a little bit more into the detail. Consistent with some of the themes that we've seen drawn out already at this conference, we have a set of dueling paradigms here. The old paradigm, which we still see a lot of here in the United States and across the world, is spectrum being held in large area licenses, but actually utilized in very targeted areas. As Richard was saying, the Calais jungle, rural Montana, those are one and the same when it comes to the ability to access spectrum by innovators and entrepreneurs. I hear from a lot of our smaller and rural providers who are really frustrated that there are gigahertz of licensed spectrum in their area, but it's unavailable for them to use for rural broadband, even if it's not being used by the license holder. So we've seen positive progress, and I'll give a couple further examples going on towards a new paradigm, which allows for unlicensed use, which allows for sharing of licensed spectrum. We still have a long way to go to modernize spectrum policy away from this legacy mechanism of distribution that tends to be very inefficient for a variety of reasons. But in the next slide, I want to give a couple of examples of areas in the U.S. where I think we've really made some positive movement towards supporting rural and supporting innovation in spectrum policy. The first is CBRS, which I'm sure is no stranger to the group here. It's the first time that a use or share mechanism has substantially made it into U.S. spectrum policy. So the framework is a three-tier. Effectively, you have your incumbents in the United States military who continue to get priority. You have a licensure framework that licenses 10 megahertz slices, 7 of them that were just made available via auction here. But the great thing is if those license holders are not utilizing that spectrum in any given locality at any given time, any other innovator is allowed to utilize that spectrum, which is a world of difference from a more legacy approach to spectrum, where if a license holder wasn't using it, an innovator couldn't come in and use it at all. CBRS is the first time that we've really seen that utilized here in the U.S., and we'd like to see many more examples of that going forward. 6 gigahertz is another example. I know that's been discussed extensively in the panel right before this one. We come at it from the angle of both, from a variety of perspectives. So WISPs are both incumbents in the 6 gigahertz band as well as new users. And they're new users both as it relates to in-home Wi-Fi, as well as trying to provide that last mile service to the household utilizing 6 gigahertz. So we think the US approach really was a fantastic one in terms of making all 1200 megahertz available for Wi-Fi, 850 megahertz available for higher power outdoor access, subject to a very straightforward automated frequency coordination system, which is still under development, but we have high hopes there. But I think these are a couple of examples that really show positive movement towards a regime that will allow for more robust spectrum usage, that will allow spectrum to be put to its best and highest use, not only at the time of licensing and then it's used by the same entity in perpetuity, but really to reflect the market as it moves and to allow folks who really have that great idea for a new service or that great desire to serve an underserved community or population to be able to do so, and to be able to do so wirelessly. So next slide, I think we'll just conclude. The digital divide is indeed a stubborn concept, and we see that very frustratingly. But I think with the 4 points that I outlined, and then particularly on the spectrum side, if we are able to move to a more dynamic, smarter, nimble spectrum policy environment, that will do amazing things to really move the ball forward. So with that, I think I'm done, and unless there are questions from Martha or the audience. And thanks for having me today.
Thank you very much, Claude. Very interesting presentation. Yes, we have questions. I had questions too, but let's give priority to the audience. So we have 2 questions so far. So one is from Hermano Pietro Semoli. And he says that WISPA members have done a remarkable job in providing connectivity in underserved areas. But he would like to know why TV white spaces have not made significant inroads. From your perspective, what are the main factors limiting deployments?
Sure. So thank you, Hermano. I'll pass that along to our members. I think they've done fantastic work as well. But yeah, TV white spaces has continued to be underutilized. I believe you're 100% correct. There have been multiple issues. I think the primary one is there still is not enough capacity there for a bang for the buck rural deployment, and I'll unpack that just a little bit. One, equipment continues to be pretty expensive. And I know there's been really strong efforts by Microsoft and others to try to drive down those equipment costs. But when you're talking a single specialized band as opposed to something more robust and having a more robust equipment ecosystem like in the Wi-Fi space, that's still a barrier. There are still a lot of regulatory barriers to robust use in the band. We've seen some very positive movement from the FCC here in recent days, increasing the height above terrain that white space providers are able to use in hanging radios and other things. There are too many details to really get into here, but not being able to use adjacent channels to TV bands remains a significant regulatory barrier. We've seen some database issues as well. We're trying to attack those all on multiple fronts, but and we have seen a lot of progress this year, but it continues to be something that providers have tried in the past, have rejected, and may be interested in trying again, but through the great work of the folks at DSA as well as their members, I think we're still moving the ball forward. Unfortunately, it's been a long road, and we're still plodding along.
Thank you, Claude. And just to mention here also, we will have a panel about this on day 3, and it's exactly about that, opportunities and challenges to scale in TV white spaces. So we will have a deeper discussion there. And also to highlight the recent decision from the FCC in the last meeting that is updating the TV white spaces rules, especially in that purpose, like trying to make it more flexible, so removing some barriers for its deployment. So we are quite a little bit limited on time. So thank you very much, Claude, and I will invite our next speaker for this session. So
Great.
Heather, welcome. Very nice to see you again. Heather was with us last year in the DSA Summit in Washington, and it's really a pleasure to see you again. So please go ahead and let us know about the recent initiatives for connectivity at the USTDA.
Great. And thank you so much, Martha. It's a pleasure to see you. I wish it could be in person, but hopefully soon. And thanks to the whole DSA team for bringing us together here today. As Martha noted, I represent the U.S. Trade and Development Agency, or USTDA, which is an independent U.S. government agency. I thought before I get started on presenting the case study, it'd be helpful to provide a little bit of context so it's clear where we fit in the picture. So let's jump into the slides, please. Great, thank you. So USTDA is unique. We work alongside U.S. industry to further the implementation of infrastructure projects in developing and emerging markets around the world. And specifically, we work at the earliest stages when design choices and technology options are being defined. And while we have a variety of tools as listed on this slide, we primarily achieve our mission by funding project preparation activities, such as feasibility studies, technical assistance, and pilot projects that connect U.S. companies to strategic projects and partners. Our goal is to help our overseas partners, which can be from both the public and private sector, structure bankable infrastructure projects that can be financed, implemented, and of course, most importantly, sustained. And globally, we work, in many markets and in many sectors, but we work in sectors that are key to economic growth, especially ICT. Next slide, please. So as you can see by this map, we have quite a robust connectivity portfolio. And I would note that connectivity, including rural connectivity, has been a central theme of our global programming, and it's growing. From piloting disruptive technologies to providing technical assistance and policy considerations, such as standards requirements, our goal is to further inclusive connectivity. And while we have a wide range of projects across many markets, our goal is to balance our programming to bridge the digital divide. And of course, we're also pursuing really interesting projects that leverage connectivity in rural and semi-rural settings for more productive agribusiness or access to services such as energy and healthcare. And in some cases, the integration of all of that in smart communities in rural and semi-rural settings. And I thought before I dive into project examples, I just want to emphasize again, because we are very different from other US government agencies. And just to be clear that when we support connectivity projects, it's actually US industry that's leading the projects and provides the expertise. So the project preparation work that we are funding is facilitating US companies to pilot their technologies or deploy services in partnership with public and private sector sponsors. And as an agency, what we have the pleasure of doing is convening and aligning these stakeholders towards mutually beneficial goals. And that's where my perspective in this presentation is grounded. And as we all know, there are many parties critical to the success of connectivity projects, particularly rural connectivity. You have industry, the regulators, champions at the central, state, local levels, financiers, among many, many others. And I've been at USTDA for about 13 years now, and I've worked in multiple regions. And I think what I've observed, I was thinking through this, just I've had the privilege of being part of many pilot projects, especially in the ICT and connectivity space, and in the Middle East and South Asia, and now Africa primarily. And I've seen projects be quite successful. And I've seen projects that were very promising, even with the best technology, face unsurmountable challenges. So then I focus today on a little bit about pilot projects and so the observations we've seen, the keys to success, and then walk through one case study that's live right now. So from my perspective, just generally speaking, the successful pilot projects that we've supported as an agency have had a value add for the test case, so have secured and secure attention and buy-in from regulators and other key stakeholders, have a strong and clear potential to lead to a multiplier effect and scale, and most importantly, set up an accessible model, particularly for financing. Next slide, please. So today I'd like to highlight an ongoing project, and I should note that the experts working on this project are participating in this event. So my goal is to simply highlight their good work and share why I think the structure of this project is a valuable model to consider. It's a fantastic photo of that project team in a beautiful space, which I think we all wish we could be in right now. But the goal of this project is to use TV white space technology to extend affordable broadband access to underserved rural communities across South Africa. And so for the last year, USTDA has been working with the Wireless Access Providers Association, or WISPA, which is a nonprofit trade association that represents South African WISPs and has over 180 member companies. And as noted, the convening power is what we always look at for pilots, and it made great sense to work with WISPA because it has a strong membership base and could serve as an effective interface between the regulator, the operators, service providers, and consumers. On the US company side, Adaptrum is leading a consortium of US companies, including Microsoft, International Data Corporation, and 2 South African companies, Project Asizwe and Stadia Capital. And from my perspective, what we know is that in South Africa, the technical value of TV white space is understood, particularly as there are a couple of preliminary TV white space activities that were fundamentally technical in nature. The market is ripe. There is an acute need for cost-effective connectivity in South Africa. And additionally, TV white space is thought to be well suited due to the terrain and population density. So in terms of the pilot, with provisional licenses permitted by the regulator, the pilot is testing the viability of TV white space at pilot sites with 3 different WISP members of WISPA. And we just talked to the project team recently, and certainly, as we've seen across the board, COVID has had challenges, but really pleased to share that despite COVID, one pilot site is up and running already, and the other should be operational by the end of the month. And pending the results of the pilot, WISPA will have the information necessary to make the case to the regulator, its member WISPs, with the goal of developing more than 1,600 base sites during project implementation. So again, going back to the model and why I think this is successful. Of course, as noted, there's a consortium of expertise. You have US and South African industry working together. And with the integrated expertise, I believe we can build a sustainable business model to provide affordable broadband using TV white space. The pilot, of course, includes deployment of the tech and architecture, but also has a very robust business, financing, and implementation plan. And as just discussed, I mean, that's incredibly important. The scalability of this is important with the members, but also obviously the financing. And right now, the project was structured to set it up for scale and accessibility. And the plan is to offer unique structured financing to all the WISPs, and that the companies are working on that together. And then lastly, of course, the convening power, the effective engagement with the regulator, but also the multiplier effect with WISPA convening its members And I think you just have one project, 3 pilots, and many, many beneficiaries. And that scale is really essential for projects or for technology that deserves and demands a scale to be successful. So due to time, I know we're running over. I'll stop here. I just wanted to share that this is one example of the work that USG is privileged to be part of around the world. And if there's time, I'd be happy to expand other projects. But with the last slide, my contact information is there, or how to access TDA. And we're a very small agency and we're demand driven. So would love to hear your ideas and hope that we can continue to engage in the future. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Heather. I have one question. You mentioned that USTDA is pursuing projects that use connectivity as a platform for services in rural and semi-rural environments. So I would like to know if you could please highlight some of the most recent projects on that.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Martha. We've done a lot of really interesting in the past smart city projects. So not at very large cities, but medium-sized communities. But we just funded a project that I'm really excited about in Ethiopia. It's a smart village project, and it's in the Amhara region of Ethiopia, which is agribusiness or agriculture-based community. And so this pilot project is actually bringing together a consortium of companies again, and it's led by Illinois-based Village Solutions. And the idea is that utilizing U.S. solar power, telecommunications, electricity, lighting, and water infrastructure, the integration of that, you'll have affordable access in the region that will help obviously provide essential services, but also help productivity. And so really excited about that. That just launched, it's actually just launching now. So stay tuned on that, but it was a different model. I think it's neat to bring together the different companies, and Village based in Illinois, of course, is doing a tremendous job. So excited about that for sure.
Hey, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Let me just check if there are any questions from the audience, because I have just been, okay. I received 3 more questions for Claude. So thank you very much, Heather, for this presentation. And we look forward to continue hearing from all these great projects in different regions of the world. So thank you, Claude, for coming back.
Of course. Always happy to.
I will take just 5 more minutes to finish this session, but I would like to make those questions. So one I got here, sorry, now I'm seeing. Okay, so this is about, you know that an important feature of CBRS in the US is the use it or share it type of rules. That allow at least temporary opportunistic access to the licensed half of the band until the license actually builds out. What are the trade-offs for WISPs and others?
Sure. So I think, as I mentioned in my presentation, I think it's an incredibly positive development to see this kind of a framework put in place because, as others have noted, we see incredible underutilization of licensed spectrum historically. And with WISPs, you see a willingness to build a business case on unlicensed spectrum or lightly licensed spectrum. I think, historically, and I think this touches on one of the other comments that I've seen made, is that we have to have this spectrum property right in order to be able to build a business case off of it. It's the innovator mindset to say, well, maybe I don't need quite the same degree of 100% certainty that I'm going to have 100% access to 100% of the spectrum all the time, but maybe there's 90% certainty that I'm going to have access to the spectrum 90% of the time, and I can build a business case on that and engineer around that where possible. And so I think you see that same sort of thinking at play in CBRS in incredibly rural areas where existing spectrum licensees have not built out. The likelihood that they will build out in CBRS is also lower. So you may see a WISP or a private LTE, provider or entrant say, I think there's enough certainty for me to be able to build a business case, even if the potential incumbent comes in at some point. And in addition to the license, the priority access license piece, there's also generally authorized access. There's a 70 to 80 megahertz split there. So, maybe I can build on, 40 megahertz of GAA, and then I'm going to bet that this 20 megahertz slice won't be built out, and then I can combine these two together to really bring out a robust service. So it's that kind of an innovative approach that shakes up the historical way of thinking that I think creates a lot of potential opportunity for both just general innovation as well as rural access.
Great, thank you. So you already answered two of the questions. I have another one. Which nations or states have minimum broadband initiatives for its population, like similar to Finland? Are the operators in these rural markets being subsidized for the foreseeable future?
So the United States has taken a little bit more of an evolving approach to service, and to understand our approach, I think you really have to understand the history. I think you see some efforts at universal access in nations like Australia with the National Broadband Network. I think the jury is still out a little bit on how that will fully work in practice. In the United States, it's been more of a let's rely on private enterprise to bring connectivity to the folks that need it, and we'll provide subsidies to incent that business case. The interesting thing that we have seen is that with that approach, there are always pluses and minuses, right? So you have a whole coterie of providers who have grown up and built businesses around subsidies, and then those frameworks have ossified, and you don't see as much innovation. And you talk to some of these businesses where there's an unserved community right next door to them, where if they're approaching things from a WISP mindset, it would be like, okay, well, how can I tether together enough spectrum and maybe some point-to-point backhaul to fiber, so I can maybe put up a couple radios and get people something. The mindset from those entities is like, well, until the government subsidizes me, I'm not going to go into that community, and we need to advocate for more subsidies in order to be able to serve that community. And those are just the two different mindsets that you see come up as a result of that policy. So absolutely, subsidies are a part of the solution. We as an organization just want to make sure that they are deployed smartly in a way that doesn't create the wrong incentives, but also allows for new entrants and innovators and scalable networks to participate, and not for the government to say, well, just because this entity has always received subsidies, they're the best situated to serve this community because they're most familiar with subsidies. That's kind of wrong-headed thinking, in our opinion. If you design a nimble framework, and I think that the US FCC has done a really incredible job in its Connect America Fund reverse auction. Granted, it's a little bit complicated, but I think it's the best distribution mechanism for subsidies that we've seen in the past. So we're looking to iterate on that and make it better for innovators and for newcomers to the broadband space.
Okay, thank you, Claude. Just one last question. I'm sorry, but this discussion is
No, this is good.
We noticed that in the US, 45 megahertz of the 5.9 gigahertz were enabled for WISP in order to provide connectivity during the COVID-19 situation. Can you give us a few updates about it? How did this measure work for the US?
So, anytime you tell a really, really small business that they're going to have to, send in a complicated application to the federal government to gain access to spectrum, there's always a little bit of a barrier there, especially when they're typically an innovate without permission type entity. But with that said, we saw an incredible result as a result of the FCC's willingness to work with WISPs to gain access to 45 megahertz of this previously almost completely unutilized auto DSRC band. That we've seen thousands upon thousands of Americans get better broadband as a result of that decision by the FCC, as opposed to when you contrast that with what we've seen from the auto industry and a few thousand cars over 20 years of having access to the spectrum. You give WISPs access to that, and in a matter of months, they're connecting thousands of Americans. So we're really enthused that the FCC is taking up action, semi-final action this month to really solidify that 45 megahertz for unlicensed, and then 30 megahertz for cellular vehicle to everything technology. We think it's the absolutely right approach, and the work that WISP has done with those special temporary authorizations that the FCC gave. It's just the proof is in the pudding.
Great. So thank you very much, Claude. I look forward also to continue working not only with you, but with other WISP associations around the world. We have been working with WAPA in South Africa and with other groups, but some countries don't have such a group. So it's really good to know that you have this association, and I look forward to hearing from other countries having this type of organized actions.
Absolutely. Thank you, Martha. This has been great.
Thank you. Have a nice day. So with that, we are going to conclude this session and all the live sessions during the DSA Summit today. Thank you for attending, and I will give the floor to Steve for the last conclusions.
Thank you, Martha. Just a few brief remarks. It's been such a fascinating series of presentations, and I want to start just with Mario Manowitz's comments in inviting everyone to engage at the ITU, as all ITU's speakers are always effusive in inviting people to engage, and how does that play out though when you're not a Nokia or a Huawei? And what is the ability of smaller players to engage? And having done some research on the response to COVID-19 and documented responses around the world, overwhelmingly, what I've seen is it's actually smaller operators using Wi-Fi that seem to predominate in terms of the deployment of physical infrastructure. While some regulators have granted spectrum to larger operators, their ability to deploy just it hasn't been practical in many cases. So it's a critical resource there, and we know that SMMEs around the world are they occupy more than 50% of GDP in many cases. So I think emphasizing the voice of the smaller operators in the regulatory environments is absolutely critical. And it was great to hear the likes of WISPA from the US and WAPA, of course, from South Africa. But there is a lack, I think, of representation of these smaller operators, and a lack of representation of their value. And that's purely a personal view, of course. And I think it is an interesting question now that also, when we look at regulation, we design regulation, in many cases for the worst case scenario, right, which is, the most densely populated urban areas, whereas in rural areas, there is often less congestion. I mean, TV white space is a great example of this in many countries where there is a lot of unused spectrum. And I think that, we seek harmonization, but at the same time, I wonder at what cost in terms of addressing the issue of rural access, where the greatest tension exists in terms of reaching the unserved. And so on that note, I'll leave you with that thought and look forward to seeing you all tomorrow. And we're starting 15 minutes later, I think, which is at 8:30 Eastern or 13:30 UTC. Thank you very much, everyone.